The cruelest doors are never locked, they simply pretend you were never meant to enter. The crystal chandeliers of the Grand Astoria Hotel scattered golden light across the marble lobby as Naomi Carter stepped out of the black town car, her satin gown moving like liquid midnight around her legs. Manhattan shimmered beyond the towering glass windows, glowing beneath the cool November rain, but inside the hotel everything felt warm, polished, untouchable. The annual Sinclair Foundation Gala was the kind of event people spent months trying to enter and years trying to forget if they failed. Senators, media moguls, luxury fashion executives, and old money families drifted beneath the gold ceilings with champagne in hand, their laughter soft and practiced like a language Naomi had spent most of her life learning without ever fully being invited to speak. She paused briefly at the entrance, smoothing one hand across the elegant black fabric at her waist while the diamonds around her wrist caught the light with quiet restraint. Ethan had told her he would meet her inside after his meeting downtown ended. 10 minutes behind you, he had promised earlier that evening, his deep voice calm through the phone. But Naomi had learned long ago that 10 minutes inside rooms like these could feel like an entire lifetime. The rain outside carried the scent of cold pavement and Manhattan traffic, but inside the ballroom there was only perfume, polished wood, and the faint sound of a piano drifting beneath conversation. Naomi handed her invitation to the young woman standing behind the glowing guest list tablet near the velvet ropes. The hostess smiled automatically at first, but the expression slowly faded as her fingers paused against the screen. Naomi noticed it immediately. Successful women always noticed hesitation. The hostess cleared her throat softly. "I'm sorry, ma'am." Naomi remained still. "Could you check again?" The woman's uncomfortable smile tightened. "Your name isn't appearing in the system." Around them, conversations continued beneath the chandeliers, but Naomi could already feel the subtle shift in the air. Eyes turning. People pretending not to stare while staring anyway. A wealthy older couple standing nearby exchanged the kind of glance that carried entire conversations without words. Naomi kept her shoulders straight. "Naomi Carter," she repeated gently. "There must be a mistake." The hostess typed again, longer this time, then looked up with visible discomfort. "I'm sorry. There's no active invitation under that name tonight." The sentence landed softly, but humiliation rarely needed volume to wound. Naomi could suddenly feel every detail of herself with painful clarity, the dark skin everyone always noticed first, the black satin gown that now felt too elegant for the room, the silence gathering around her like smoke. A woman in a silver designer dress standing near the entrance let out a quiet laugh behind her champagne flute. "These events are getting harder to control every year," she murmured to her companion, just loud enough to be heard. Naomi recognized her instantly. Victoria Langford. Socialite royalty. Board member. The kind of woman born believing every room belonged to her before she even entered it. Victoria tilted her head slightly, her pale diamonds glittering beneath the chandelier light. "Perhaps the invitation belonged to someone else," she said smoothly. "It happens." Naomi looked at her for only a second before returning her attention to the hostess. Her expression never cracked. Never begged. Never explained. Years ago, she might have fought harder to be believed. But dignity had taught her something power never could. Sometimes people decide who you are before you ever open your mouth. The young hostess lowered her voice apologetically. "I can ask security to escort you to guest services downstairs if you'd like." Naomi inhaled slowly, her wedding ring catching a flicker of gold light as her fingers tightened around her clutch. Somewhere above the ballroom, crystal chandeliers sparkled like stars over people who had already decided she did not belong among them. And for the first time that night, Naomi realized this was no mistake at all. The silence around Naomi deepened with every passing second, not loud enough to draw attention from the entire ballroom but sharp enough to cut through her composure like winter glass. The pianist near the center stage continued playing a soft jazz arrangement while waiters in white gloves drifted between tables carrying silver trays of champagne, pretending not to notice what was unfolding near the entrance. But people always noticed humiliation when it happened to someone they believed stood lower than them. Especially in rooms built on status. Naomi lowered her gaze briefly to the glowing guest list tablet, its cold white screen reflecting against her dark skin beneath the chandelier light. Her name had been there 3 days ago when Ethan personally forwarded the confirmation email to her assistant. She remembered because he had teased her about arriving before him for once. "Do not let those Wall Street dinosaurs bore you before I get there," he had joked earlier that morning while adjusting his cufflinks in the penthouse dressing room overlooking Central Park. The memory now felt impossibly far away. Victoria Langford stepped closer, the diamonds at her throat glittering like frozen stars against her silver gown. Her smile remained elegant, almost sympathetic, which somehow made it crueler. "The Sinclair Foundation events are invitation only," she said softly enough to sound polite while ensuring everyone nearby could still hear every word. "Security has had problems lately with unverified guests trying to enter." Naomi felt the sting immediately. Not because of the words themselves, but because of how familiar they were. The careful language wealthy people used when they wanted exclusion to sound civilized. Around them, several guests shifted awkwardly while others watched openly now, curiosity winning over manners. A man near the champagne tower whispered something to his wife, and she responded with the kind of pitying smile people reserved for public embarrassment they were grateful was not happening to them. Naomi straightened slowly, her satin gown catching the golden ballroom light like flowing ink. "I understand," she said calmly to the hostess. "Thank you for checking." The young woman behind the tablet looked relieved by Naomi's grace, almost guilty for participating in the moment at all. "I truly am sorry, ma'am." Naomi nodded once. She could feel Victoria watching her carefully now, waiting for anger, tears, or desperation. Waiting for a scene. But Naomi Carter had spent most of her life surviving rooms that underestimated her. She knew exactly how quickly dignity became power when everyone expected humiliation instead. "No," Victoria said lightly as Naomi turned toward the exit. "I believe the issue is simply confusion." Naomi paused. Victoria lifted her champagne flute slowly, her pale lips curving with calculated sweetness. "You know how these galas work. People see luxury online and suddenly believe they belong inside it." A few uncomfortable laughs fluttered nearby. Small. Nervous. Enough to wound anyway. Naomi felt heat rise beneath her skin, but her face remained composed. Outside the towering glass doors, rain slid down Manhattan in silver streaks while black cars lined the curb beneath the glowing hotel awning. Inside, crystal light reflected across marble floors polished so perfectly they mirrored the people standing above them. Naomi suddenly became aware of every detail around her. The whispers. The glances. The hostess avoiding eye contact. The security guard taking a hesitant step closer. And beneath all of it, the old ache she thought she had buried years ago. The exhausting feeling of having to prove she belonged in rooms where others were welcomed automatically. Her fingers brushed the wedding ring resting against her skin, the diamond catching one sharp beam of chandelier light. For a moment, she considered calling Ethan. One text message would end this instantly. One appearance from him would change the entire atmosphere of the room. But something inside her resisted. Because the deeper wound was no longer the missing invitation. It was the realization that without Ethan Sinclair standing beside her, these people had already decided exactly who she was. Naomi lifted her chin gracefully and stepped back from the velvet ropes. "You are right about one thing," she said quietly, meeting Victoria's icy blue eyes for the first time. "These rooms do reveal who people really are." Then she turned toward the exit beneath the gold light of the chandeliers while the ballroom watched her walk away in silence. The rain outside had grown heavier by the time Naomi stepped beneath the covered entrance of the Grand Astoria Hotel, each silver drop streaking down the glass walls overlooking Fifth Avenue like tears the city itself refused to shed. Behind her, the ballroom glowed in gold and crystal, alive with laughter that now sounded distant and hollow against the cold November night. A valet rushed past carrying umbrellas for arriving guests while cameras flashed near the front staircase where another celebrity couple had just arrived. No one stopped to ask if she was all right. People in rooms like these rarely interrupted discomfort unless it threatened their own evening. Naomi stood near one of the marble columns beside the entrance, her fingers wrapped lightly around her silver clutch while the black satin sleeves of her gown shimmered beneath the hotel lights. She could still hear Victoria's voice echoing in her mind. People see luxury online and suddenly believe they belong inside it. The cruelty of it was not loud. That was what made it dangerous. It was polished. Refined. Designed to leave bruises no one else could see. Naomi exhaled slowly, watching her breath briefly cloud against the cool air drifting through the revolving doors. She told herself she should leave. Call the driver. Go home before Ethan arrived and turned a humiliating moment into public gossip by defending her in front of half the city's elite. But her feet refused to move. Somewhere deep inside, another feeling had begun to surface beneath the embarrassment. Exhaustion. Not from tonight alone, but from years of carefully navigating spaces where she constantly had to prove she deserved to stand beside the man she loved. The security guard stationed near the entrance glanced toward her with visible sympathy before quickly looking away again. Even pity felt unbearable tonight. Naomi lifted her eyes toward the ballroom one last time through the towering glass doors. Crystal chandeliers sparkled above women wrapped in couture gowns while men in tailored tuxedos laughed beside towers of champagne. The entire room looked like a painting of wealth and belonging. And yet Naomi suddenly remembered the first night Ethan had taken her to one of these events 3 years ago. She had stood frozen in front of their penthouse mirror, adjusting the neckline of a dark blue gown while trying to ignore the nervousness tightening in her chest. Ethan had walked up behind her quietly then, his reflection appearing beside hers in the mirror. "You know what the difference is between you and everyone else in those rooms?" he had asked. Naomi remembered laughing softly. "About $10 billion? But Ethan had only shaken his head before fastening the diamond bracelet around her wrist himself. "No. They spent their lives trying to become impressive. You already are." The memory hit harder than she expected. Naomi lowered her gaze quickly, blinking against the sting behind her eyes before it could become visible. She would not cry here. Not beneath the gold lights of a hotel filled with strangers waiting to witness weakness disguised as entertainment. The revolving doors suddenly spun open again as another gust of cold air swept through the entrance. Several hotel employees immediately straightened at once. The valet staff shifted positions. Security earpieces crackled softly. Naomi noticed the change instantly. Power always announced itself before speaking. A sleek black motorcade had just pulled beneath the hotel awning outside, headlights cutting through the rain like silver blades against the Manhattan night. Guests near the entrance began whispering quietly while phones appeared in manicured hands beneath tuxedo sleeves and diamond bracelets. Naomi felt her stomach tighten before she even saw him. One of the hotel managers hurried toward the doors, smoothing his jacket nervously while adjusting his tie. Then the rear passenger door opened slowly beneath the rain-soaked lights of Fifth Avenue, and Ethan Sinclair stepped out onto the curb in a charcoal overcoat, his dark hair damp from the storm, his expression calm in the way powerful men became when entire cities moved around them without resistance. The atmosphere inside the hotel changed instantly. Conversations paused. Staff members straightened. Executives near the ballroom entrance lowered their voices. And for the first time that evening, Naomi realized she was no longer standing invisible in the cold. Power did not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it entered a room with nothing more than silence and certainty, and every person inside instinctively stepped aside. Ethan Sinclair crossed the rain-soaked curb beneath the Grand Astoria lights with the calm precision of a man who had spent years carrying the weight of billion-dollar decisions without ever needing to raise his voice. His charcoal overcoat moved sharply against the wind while Manhattan traffic reflected silver across the wet pavement behind him. The hotel manager rushed forward immediately, smiling too quickly, speaking too carefully. "Mr. Sinclair, welcome. We were not expecting you quite so soon this evening." Ethan handed his car keys to the valet without looking away from the entrance. "Neither was I." His voice was low, controlled, impossible to ignore. Inside the lobby, Naomi remained near the marble column beneath the chandelier light, suddenly aware that every eye in the room had shifted direction. Executives who moments ago had barely noticed her were now watching Ethan with eager attention, adjusting jackets and smoothing expressions as though preparing for inspection. The security guard standing nearby stepped back instinctively. Victoria Langford's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly near the ballroom doors, though her polished smile remained perfectly intact. Ethan finally stepped through the revolving glass doors, bringing with him the cold scent of rain and winter air. For a brief moment, his eyes scanned the ballroom automatically, acknowledging donors, politicians, board members. Then he saw Naomi standing alone beside the entrance in her black satin gown. Everything else disappeared from his expression. Concern replaced formality instantly. Ethan walked toward her without slowing, his polished shoes echoing softly across the marble floor while conversations around them faded into uneasy silence. Naomi felt her chest tighten unexpectedly as he stopped in front of her beneath the gold chandelier light. Up close, she could see faint traces of rain still clinging to his dark hair and the exhaustion beneath his gray eyes from a day spent running an empire. But the moment he looked at her face, something colder appeared in his expression. "Why are you standing out here?" he asked quietly. Naomi tried to answer calmly. "There was an issue with the guest list." Ethan's eyes shifted briefly toward the entrance tablet, then toward the visibly nervous hostess. "An issue?" The single word changed the atmosphere immediately. The hostess swallowed hard. "Mr. Sinclair, I believe there may have been some confusion with the registration system." Ethan looked back at Naomi. "Did they let you inside?" Naomi hesitated for only a second too long. That was enough. Ethan's jaw tightened subtly while the ballroom around them became painfully still. Nearby guests suddenly found their champagne glasses fascinating. No one wanted to be caught watching the moment directly anymore. Victoria stepped forward gracefully before the silence could deepen further. "Ethan," she said warmly, as though greeting an old friend at a country club luncheon. "I am sure this is all just an unfortunate misunderstanding. Security has been trying to maintain standards tonight and there was concern regarding the invitation." Ethan turned slowly toward her, his expression unreadable. "Concern?" Victoria's diamonds shimmered beneath the chandelier as she offered a polished laugh. "You know how these events can become. People arrive claiming connections all the time." The room froze completely. Naomi closed her eyes briefly, not from weakness but from the exhausting familiarity of hearing prejudice disguised as etiquette. Ethan noticed it immediately. When he spoke again, his voice became dangerously calm. "Naomi." She looked at him quietly. Ethan reached for her hand with deliberate gentleness, his thumb brushing lightly against her wedding ring before he turned toward the ballroom. "Would someone here like to explain," he said slowly, "why my wife was left standing outside in the rain while half this city drank champagne under my name?" The silence that followed felt heavier than thunder. Across the ballroom, faces drained of color beneath crystal light. Somewhere near the orchestra stage, a champagne glass slipped from nervous fingers and shattered softly against marble. But Ethan never looked away from Naomi, as though the only thing in that entire room that mattered anymore was the humiliation written carefully behind her composure. The silence inside the Grand Astoria ballroom no longer felt elegant. It felt terrified. Beneath the crystal chandeliers, politicians, investors, and old-money socialites stood frozen around white linen tables and towers of untouched champagne while Ethan Sinclair's question lingered over the room like judgment itself. Naomi could feel the shift immediately. Only minutes earlier, she had been invisible to them. Now every glance carried calculation instead of dismissal. Power had entered the room, and suddenly dignity mattered again. Ethan remained beside her, his hand resting lightly against hers with quiet certainty. He did not squeeze tightly or perform affection for the crowd. That was not his way. Ethan Sinclair had never needed dramatic gestures to command attention. His calm alone unsettled people more than anger ever could. Victoria Langford recovered first, though Naomi noticed the slight tension around her smile now. "Ethan," she began carefully, lifting her champagne flute as though the evening were still under her control, "surely we do not need to turn a small misunderstanding into a public spectacle." Ethan finally looked at her directly. A misunderstanding would require honesty. The softness in his voice somehow made the sentence colder. Nearby, several members of the Sinclair Foundation board shifted uneasily. One elderly donor quietly stepped away from Victoria altogether. The hostess behind the digital guest list tablet looked moments away from tears. Ethan noticed immediately. "What is your name?" he asked her gently. "Emily, sir." "Emily," Ethan said calmly, "did my wife's invitation disappear by accident?" The young woman swallowed hard as dozens of wealthy eyes turned toward her. Naomi could see the fear in her expression. Fear of losing her job. Fear of humiliating someone powerful. Fear of saying the wrong thing in a room where truth rarely protected the vulnerable. Ethan's tone softened slightly. "You are not in trouble for telling the truth." Emily glanced nervously toward Victoria before lowering her eyes. Mrs. Langford requested a manual removal from the active guest registry about 20 minutes before the gala began. The ballroom seemed to stop breathing. Naomi watched the color drain slowly from Victoria's face beneath the gold chandelier light. "That is ridiculous," Victoria replied quickly, though the sharpness in her voice betrayed her composure for the first time all evening. "There must have been confusion regarding verification procedures." Ethan turned toward the hotel manager standing nearby like a man awaiting execution. "Pull the security logs." The manager nearly stumbled over his own words. "Right away, Mr. Sinclair." Naomi remained silent, but inside something painful had begun unraveling. Not because Victoria had removed her name. That part almost felt expected now. It was the realization that this humiliation had been intentional from the beginning. Planned beneath sparkling chandeliers and champagne towers by people who smiled while deciding she did not belong among them. Ethan must have sensed the shift in her because he looked down at her briefly, his expression softening in a way no one else in the room had ever witnessed publicly. "Hey," he said quietly enough for only her to hear. "Look at me." Naomi lifted her eyes slowly. "You did nothing wrong." The simple sentence nearly broke her composure more than the humiliation itself. Because Ethan was the only person in that entire ballroom who understood the exhaustion hidden beneath her elegance. The exhaustion of constantly entering rooms prepared to question her presence before hearing her voice. Across the ballroom, hotel staff rushed nervously between security monitors while whispers spread through the crowd like cracks through glass. Naomi caught fragments drifting beneath the orchestra music. "His wife? I had no idea. Victoria actually removed her? This is going to destroy the Langfords." But Ethan showed no satisfaction. No cruelty. Only disappointment sharpened into resolve. A security supervisor finally approached holding a tablet with trembling hands. "Mr. Sinclair," he said carefully, "the footage confirms Mrs. Langford instructed staff to delete Mrs. Sinclair's credentials personally before guest arrival." The final illusion shattered completely. Victoria's polished expression collapsed for half a second before returning again, colder now, more desperate. But it was already too late. Because beneath the golden chandeliers of Manhattan's most exclusive gala, every person in that room had just realized the same terrifying truth. The woman they dismissed at the door was not someone trying to enter power. She already belonged to the man who owned the room. The orchestra had stopped playing completely now. Beneath the towering chandeliers of the Grand Astoria ballroom, the silence felt almost sacred, as though the room itself understood it was witnessing the collapse of something carefully protected for years. Reputation. Privilege. Illusion. Victoria Langford stood near the marble staircase with one gloved hand still wrapped around her champagne flute, but the confidence she had worn so elegantly earlier in the evening was beginning to crack beneath the weight of exposed truth. Naomi noticed it in the way Victoria's shoulders stiffened every time another whisper moved through the crowd. Wealthy people feared humiliation more than failure. Failure could be hidden behind investments and headlines. Humiliation lived forever in memory. Ethan remained calm beside Naomi, his expression unreadable beneath the soft gold lighting reflecting across the ballroom ceiling. That frightened people more than rage ever could. Men who screamed could still be negotiated with. Men who went quiet had already made their decision. The Sinclair Foundation board members gathered nervously near the stage while hotel executives moved back and forth carrying tablets and phones with pale, anxious faces. Naomi could almost feel the atmosphere shifting around them in waves. Earlier that night, these same people had looked through her as though she were an inconvenience standing too close to wealth. Now they watched her carefully, measuring every expression she made because suddenly her feelings mattered to the most powerful man in the room. The realization left a bitter ache beneath her ribs. Ethan finally turned toward the chairman of the foundation, an older man named Richard Holloway whose silver cuff links glimmered beneath the chandelier light as he adjusted his tie nervously. "How long has Victoria served on the board?" Ethan asked. 6 years, Richard answered carefully. Ethan nodded once. "Effective tonight, remove her." The sentence landed softly, but the impact moved through the ballroom like a shockwave. Victoria's face lost color immediately. "Ethan," she said sharply, taking a step forward. "You cannot seriously be making decisions this drastic over one misunderstanding." Ethan looked at her with frightening calm. "You publicly humiliated my wife using an organization funded by my family's name." Victoria's polished composure finally fractured. "I was protecting the image of the gala." Naomi saw it then. The truth hidden beneath all the elegance and diamonds and polished manners. Victoria truly believed she had done nothing wrong. To her, Naomi had simply disrupted the social order she spent her life defending. Ethan's eyes darkened slightly. The image of this gala was destroyed the moment kindness became optional. Around them, several guests lowered their eyes in visible shame. A woman near the orchestra stage quietly removed the Langford Foundation pin from her designer gown. 2 investors whispered urgently to each other before stepping away from Victoria entirely. Social exile happened quickly among the wealthy. No one wanted to drown beside a sinking name. Victoria laughed once, though the sound carried panic now instead of control. "You are overreacting because you married someone beneath your world and cannot admit the consequences." The words cut through the ballroom with brutal clarity. Naomi felt the air leave her lungs quietly. Several guests gasped beneath the crystal lights while Richard Holloway closed his eyes as though physically pained by the sentence. But Ethan never looked angry. Somehow that made the moment even colder. He stepped slightly closer to Naomi instead, his hand resting gently against the small of her back. Protective. Certain. Proud. "No," he said quietly. "The greatest thing I ever did was marry a woman whose dignity does not depend on whether cruel people approve of her." The silence afterward felt endless. Naomi looked down briefly, overwhelmed not by the attention surrounding them but by the sincerity in Ethan's voice. He was not defending her because cameras were present or because powerful men feared scandal. He meant every word. And somehow that hurt almost more than the humiliation earlier. Because beneath all the luxury and penthouses and private jets, Naomi realized she had spent years secretly wondering whether Ethan ever regretted bringing her into a world that never fully welcomed her. Ethan turned calmly toward Richard again. Withdraw Sinclair Holdings from all pending partnerships involving the Langford Group. Victoria's champagne glass trembled visibly in her hand. You cannot destroy my family over this. Ethan finally met her eyes one last time. I am not destroying your family, Victoria. His voice remained perfectly controlled beneath the chandeliers. I am simply refusing to reward people who mistake cruelty for class. The ballroom no longer resembled a celebration. Beneath the glow of crystal chandeliers and gold-trimmed ceilings, the Grand Astoria had transformed into something colder, quieter, almost ceremonial. Waiters carrying silver trays moved carefully between tables where untouched champagne sat warming beneath candlelight while whispers spread through the room faster than music ever could. Naomi stood beside Ethan near the center of the ballroom floor, her black satin gown reflecting soft gold across the polished marble beneath her feet. For the first time all evening, no one looked through her. They looked at her too carefully now. The same people who had dismissed her near the entrance were suddenly lowering their voices when she passed, adjusting expressions, pretending they had not participated in the humiliation unfolding only minutes earlier. Wealthy people understood one thing better than kindness: consequences. Victoria Langford remained near the staircase, but the confidence that once surrounded her like perfume had evaporated completely. Several socialites who had stood beside her earlier now drifted subtly away, creating distance without appearing obvious. One investor quietly slipped his phone from his pocket while whispering instructions to an assistant. Naomi recognized the look immediately. Damage control. Ethan's decisions were already moving through Manhattan's financial world before the evening had even ended. Richard Holloway approached Ethan cautiously with a tablet in hand. The withdrawal notices have already been sent to the Langford Group's legal office, he said quietly. Ethan nodded once without taking the tablet. And the merger? Cancelled effective immediately. Across the ballroom, Victoria overheard enough to understand. Naomi watched her face pale beneath the chandelier light as reality finally settled around her diamonds and silk like ice. The Langford family empire depended heavily on Sinclair partnerships. Charity boards opened doors. Sinclair closed or opened entire industries. Victoria took 2 unsteady steps forward. Ethan, please, she said, her voice suddenly stripped of its polished superiority. You cannot dismantle decades of business relationships over one social mistake. Ethan's expression never changed. This was not a social mistake. His voice remained calm enough to make the room uneasy all over again. This was calculated humiliation. Victoria's eyes shifted toward Naomi briefly, and for the first time there was no arrogance left inside them. Only fear. I did not think it would become this serious. Naomi felt something unexpected move through her then. Not triumph. Not satisfaction. Just sadness. Because Victoria truly seemed shocked that cruelty toward someone she considered beneath her could carry consequences. That realization revealed more about the room than any speech ever could. Ethan finally looked toward the orchestra stage where the musicians still sat frozen in uncomfortable silence. Continue the evening, he said quietly to the event director nearby. The foundation tonight is still raising money for children's hospitals. Let us not punish them for this. Several guests visibly relaxed at his words, grateful for permission to breathe again. Slowly, conversation began returning beneath the chandeliers in cautious waves. Soft piano music drifted back into the ballroom while waiters resumed carrying champagne through the crowd. But the atmosphere had changed permanently. Naomi could feel it in every glance following her across the room now. Respect born not from understanding her worth, but from understanding Ethan's power. Somehow that truth hurt more than Victoria's insults earlier. Ethan turned toward her gently. Are you all right? Naomi looked up at him beneath the warm gold light. He asked the question sincerely, not as a billionaire protecting his image, but as the man who knew exactly how deeply silence could wound her. Naomi tried to answer immediately, but her throat tightened unexpectedly. Ethan noticed at once. His expression softened. Naomi. She lowered her eyes briefly toward her wedding ring. I just keep wondering, she admitted quietly, if they would have treated me differently tonight if I had walked in without your last name. Around them, wealthy guests continued pretending the gala had returned to normal, but Ethan heard the pain beneath her words instantly. The pain had nothing to do with invitations anymore. It was about belonging. About the exhausting loneliness of constantly feeling tolerated instead of welcomed. Ethan stepped slightly closer, shielding her from the ballroom without making a scene. Listen to me carefully, he said softly. The problem was never who you are. The problem is that some people mistake privilege for superiority because they have never learned the difference. Naomi felt emotion tighten painfully inside her chest as the chandeliers shimmered overhead like distant stars. For years she had mastered elegance, restraint, composure. But Ethan's quiet certainty threatened to unravel all of it far more than humiliation ever had. Because beneath the gold light and polished luxury of the ballroom, he was looking at her as though she had never needed anyone's permission to belong there at all. An hour later, the ballroom had regained its music but not its innocence. Beneath the grand Astoria chandeliers, couples danced carefully across polished marble while string lights shimmered against towering windows overlooking the silver glow of Manhattan after rain. Conversations had resumed, champagne continued flowing, and waiters carried delicate plates through clusters of wealthy guests pretending the evening had not nearly collapsed beneath the weight of exposed cruelty. But Naomi could still feel it lingering beneath every polite smile directed toward her now. Awareness. Caution. Guilt. She stood alone for a moment near the rooftop terrace doors, the cool air drifting softly against her skin as she stared out across the city skyline. The black satin of her gown moved gently in the wind while distant traffic lights blinked below like scattered stars trapped beneath glass. Somewhere behind her, laughter rose briefly from the ballroom before fading again beneath piano music. Ethan had stepped away to handle calls from the foundation board and several frantic executives already distancing themselves from the Langford family. Naomi knew how quickly powerful circles protected themselves once consequences appeared. Tonight would dominate headlines by morning. But none of that mattered as much as the quiet ache still sitting inside her chest. She closed her eyes briefly, inhaling the cold rooftop air. You disappear every time people become too loud. Ethan's voice arrived softly behind her. Naomi turned slowly to find him standing near the terrace doorway, his tie loosened slightly now, the tension of the evening visible beneath his composed expression. The city lights reflected silver across his gray eyes as he stepped closer. I was looking for you. Naomi managed a faint smile. I just needed a minute. Ethan moved beside her beneath the rooftop lights, resting his hands lightly against the railing overlooking the city. For a while neither of them spoke. Below them, Manhattan pulsed endlessly with ambition, loneliness, wealth, heartbreak, and people still searching for places where they belonged. Finally Naomi looked down at the diamond ring resting against her finger. Can I tell you something terrible? Ethan turned toward her fully. Always. She laughed softly, though sadness lingered beneath it. Part of me expected tonight to happen. Ethan's expression tightened immediately. Naomi stared out across the skyline instead of at him. Not exactly like this, she admitted quietly. But every time I walk into rooms like that one, there is always this moment where people try to figure out why I am there. Her voice remained calm, but Ethan could hear the exhaustion hidden carefully beneath every word. And when they realize I am your wife, suddenly everything changes. The smiles become warmer. The respect appears out of nowhere. It makes me wonder sometimes who they are actually respecting. Ethan stayed silent, listening the way he always did when something truly mattered. Naomi folded her arms lightly against the cold wind. Tonight just confirmed what I have been trying not to say out loud for years. She finally looked at him then, vulnerability softening the elegance she carried so carefully in public. I think part of me has always been afraid that one day you would realize I do not belong in your world either. The confession settled between them beneath the silver rooftop lights. Ethan stared at her for several seconds as though the thought itself physically hurt him. Then he stepped closer until only inches separated them from the city stretching endlessly below. Naomi, he said quietly, do you remember the first time we met? She nodded faintly. The charity auction in Brooklyn. Ethan smiled softly at the memory. Every person in that room was trying to impress someone important. You were the only person there treating the staff like they mattered more than the cameras. Naomi looked away, embarrassed by the memory. But Ethan gently touched her hand again. That night I realized something. His voice lowered beneath the distant music drifting from the ballroom. Most people spend their lives chasing status because they think it creates value. But you walked into every room already carrying yours. Naomi felt emotion rise painfully in her chest again. Ethan's thumb brushed lightly against her wedding ring beneath the rooftop lights. You were never the woman who did not belong there tonight, he said softly. They were. For the first time since arriving at the gala, Naomi felt something inside her finally begin to loosen. Not because the humiliation had disappeared, but because beneath the glittering skyline of Manhattan, the man standing beside her saw her with the same certainty whether the world approved or not.